Welcome, students. My name is Mr. Little, and today we're going to be doing an SAQ short answer question review for AP Social Studies classes. So whether you're in AP Euro, AP World, AP US, this review is for you. In these SAQ reviews, we're going to be using something called the ACE method to answer the SAQ. Now, if you are familiar with the ACE method, if your teacher uses it, great, awesome. If you are not familiar with the ACE method, please pause this video and go ahead and read this handy chart I put here, explaining how the ACE method works. Whether you've just heard about it or this is something you're familiar with, that's okay, because we're going to ace the SAQ. So before we get to the actual review itself, I want to quick go over the two purposes of this review. Purpose number one, to practice writing a short answer question using publicly available released College Board SAQs, all of which are going to be linked in the description below. Second thing, to review content via a broad overview. The great thing about SAQs is they tend to touch on big course themes or big course topics. And so by going through these questions, by thinking them through and brainstorming possible answers to them, it gives us an opportunity to do a little bit of content review. All right, so it looks like for this SAQ, we have a stimulus that comes from a book about environmental history from the 2017 exam, and it has been modified slightly for the sake of this presentation. It looks like it's discussing the rise of the human population, as well as the increasing lack of diversity in the food being produced around the world. Almost invariably, human expansion caused a reduction in quality and diversity of vegetation, or to put it in other terms, a reduction in the biomass and biodiversity. Interesting. Okay. There's an identify question that asks about a 20th century development. There's an explain question that asks about the time period under discussion here specifically, and another explain question that seems to ask about a development before this time period specifically. I also should note this is a secondary source, although I don't think that's going to necessarily have any bearing on the answers. It's always good to double check if your SAQ source is primary or secondary. So what are some first impressions I get about this document? Well, the questions in particular seem to be asking about what kind of argument is being made in the passage. And the argument made in the passage seems to simply be that during the 1400s to the 1700s, humans continued to use agriculture as their primary means of income. A nice reminder that even only 300 years ago, industrialism and the Industrial Revolution was not the primary form of human activity, but it also talks about the environmental consequences of this particular intensification of agriculture. In particular, I just can't help but think about the Columbian Exchange, right? When it talks about the selection of one or few favored plant species, that just sounds like the Columbian Exchange, the trade of the use of maize and potatoes in Ireland and Europe, as well as wheat being grown in the United States, in the Americas. Although I notice it doesn't really talk about cash crops, even though it does seem to be talking about the environmental consequences of all this human agriculture. Also, it's asking globally. So even though this sounds a lot like the Columbian Exchange, I can't help but notice that it says globally, which means we could talk about anything. We talk about China, South Asia, the Americas, Africa, and Europe in any of our answers. Pause this video and take about 3 minutes and see if you can brainstorm some answers. It's always critical when you're doing a writing assessment to take at least some time to do just a little bit of brainstorming before you start writing. Remember, plan more, write less. So in terms of some possible responses to this particular SAQ and its questions, for the identify a late 20th century development that is anything like, I think, after 1950, I'm thinking there's a couple of great examples. You could talk about the Green Revolution, which was the movement to use more fertilizers and technologies to increase crop yields, as well as spreading modified crops to places they didn't exist previously. The general environmental movement that springs up in the second half of the 20th century against pollution and later against global warming, as well as the various state policies that focused on production. I'm thinking of, for example, villagization in Ethiopia and Tanzania, as well as the Great Leap Forward in China, in which the efforts to grow large amounts of food resulted in large human migration, which also happened in Unit 4. So that's something interesting to think about. In terms of question B, I'm thinking about a historic example from that time period that goes along with the author's argument about intensified use of the land, a single crop, as well as the environmental damage or loss of diversity that comes with that. I'm thinking about plantation agriculture in the Americas. I'm thinking about the indigenous Americans and their various agricultural implements, such as chinampas and terraces. The Columbian Exchange would also seem to be a pretty slam dunk if we need to talk about an example from that time period, as well as the Chinese promotion of sweet potato and maize cultivation under the Ming Dynasty, which they got from the Spanish in the Philippines. In terms of a historic example from before the time period, there's a couple. We can't go too far back, but we can pick on a few things. So, for example, champa rice or fast ripening rice in the Song Dynasty would be an example of the spread of a single crop. We've got medieval Europe's 3-field system and an iron plow using technology to intensify production, as well as the diffusion of crops across the Islamic world. This would also be an example of single selected crops being spread and widely cultivated. All right, now you are going to attempt to write an SAQ. So pause this video, go set a timer for 15 minutes, and then come on back, and you can compare what you wrote to the ACE answers that I'm going to provide. Now, I want to be really clear here that there are many different ways to answer this SAQ. And so if you didn't write the exact same thing that I wrote, that's okay. That's not a big deal. All right, so here are my 3 answers to these 3 questions related to this SAQ. I've used the ACE method, and you can see the color coding in the left-hand corner. So for the first question, one development from the late 20th century I chose to talk about would be the states who put massive emphasis on agricultural production, such as Tanzania. That could have sparked the author's interest in the question of intensified agriculture in the early modern period. In terms of one historically specific example from that time period, I chose to talk about commercial agriculture and specifically cash crops in the Caribbean, specifically sugar plantations in the Caribbean, by pointing out that in fact, commercial agriculture had existed long before this time. However, it's the demand for sugar in growing and industrializing European cities that led to the creation of these massive sugar plantations and intensification of sugar production in the Caribbean, which also had negative environmental consequences such as deforestation and soil exhaustion in order to grow sugar for export. And this would support the author's argument. In terms of a historically specific example from before the time period, I chose to talk about the diffusion of crops throughout the Islamic world, and specifically citrus. Citrus had long been known in parts of Asia before the religion of Islam came along. However, with the expansion of Islam came the increasing contact and trade within that realm, and that included bringing citrus fruits over to Europe, where they were viewed as a valuable crop because they played a role in many medieval medicines. And so the intensification of citrus cultivation, especially in Southern Europe for export to Northern Europe, is an example of the author's argument from before the time period of 1450. Alrighty, and that is a wrap for this particular SAQ review, but I'm going to encourage you to take some time, go back perhaps, and try writing a different answer using a different one of those ideas we brainstormed as possible answers. And take the ACE method, go practice with another SAQ. Keep practicing, keep reviewing. Thanks for joining me. I'm Mr. Little, and I'll see you next time.